Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're prepared to resume where we left off yesterday. This is still, I think, the 134th meeting of the Massachusetts Gaming Commission, second session. And we're going to continue this morning and throughout the day with the presentation of reports by the commissioners. And the first report to be presented this morning is the mitigation report by Commissioner Cameron. Good morning, Commissioner.
Good morning, Commissioners, and everyone listening here and online. My section of the evaluation is mitigation, and the first thing we do is just a definition. How does mitigation relate to this particular portion of the application and our analysis? So, certainly, the applicant needs to demonstrate community support, mitigate impacts with the host and surrounding community agreements, address traffic and transportation issues, promote responsible gaming and address problem gambling, and how does the applicant protect and enhance the lottery? So that's what we will be looking at in detail with this presentation. So we had 38 questions, and we grouped them into 4 different groupings according to which category we thought they fell into. Community support, which includes the host community agreements, the surrounding community agreements, and the impacted live entertainment venues. Traffic and on-site impacts. Next, we spent an awful lot of time with traffic and off-site impacts. This is an urban area, and these issues are really important. Measures to promote responsible gaming and mitigate problem gambling, as well as, again, protecting and enhancing the lottery. The first 2 they're all important, but the first 2 are especially important to this region. So our methodology, something that I'm comfortable with, kind of the who, what, when, where, and why. Looked at it as a mini investigation. The who are our consultants and subject matter experts. The what materials and presentations did we review? The when, we started this process, this review process, directly after the applications were due on December 31st of 2013. Where, in Region A, we're talking about Revere and Everett. And why? Mitigation is really important to communities. We will be using the same ratings as my fellow commissioners. We had a detailed explanation yesterday with the insufficient, sufficient, very good, and outstanding. The only thing I will add is we had a number of questions that we considered kind of check the box, meaning they were required to submit documents, materials, and if they did that appropriately, they were sufficient in their rating. So we'll start with the who and our advisors. I was very fortunate to have an able team advising me, and it started with Mark van der Linden, who is our Director of Research and Problem Gambling. He was assisted with Dr. Jeff Murata, who has his own company, Problem Gambling Solutions. They assisted ably with the numerous questions involving problem gambling. Gordon Carr from MGC Strategies, longtime economic development project manager, really an asset to the overall team. Green International is especially important in this presentation. They are our traffic engineers, Frank Tramontosi, Wing Wong, Jason Sobel. Spent an awful lot of time on traffic, as I just mentioned. City Point Partners, Rick Moore, environmental specialist, also very, very strong, helping us with transportation issues. And Pink & Company, our overall project managers, in particular, Nancy Stark and Melissa Martinez. Thank you so much for your help. So what did we review for our analysis? Certainly the Category 1 application, the input from all the public meetings and hearings, The applicant presentations to the commission, all the environmental documents, public comment letters and emails. I was reading more of them yesterday. They continue to come in with regard to these applicants. Site visits were made by the subject matter experts as well as commissioners. We looked at the proposed locations here in the Commonwealth as well as the current locations in Las Vegas and Connecticut. Website research was done, in particular with problem gaming. And the MGC staff and our technical consultants had numerous meetings with other stakeholders, and that input was invaluable as well. So the when, I just mentioned that we started our reviews the beginning of January. The applications were due the end of December. We had applicant presentations on January 22nd. We had public meetings in March of 25th and the 26th. June 24th, 25th, we had host community hearings, July 15th as well. July 16th through 18th, we had site visits by the commissioners to the locations. August 11th and 12th, we closed out the host community hearing, and here we are in September making our presentations of findings. The where, we've seen this map before. In red, it's a little hard to see, but in red we have the two host communities, Revere and Everett. In what looks to be green on this map, these are all of the surrounding nearby community agreements. And the top left denotes the entire Region A area of the Commonwealth. We saw these pictures from Site and Design. It's just, these are the two proposed facilities, a couple of renderings from the Mohegan Sun Revere applicant and two from the Wynn Everett application as well. So, mitigation is important to communities. Why? The why portion of this evaluation. It's really important that the voices be heard, community voices, and we listen to an awful lot of people. Transportation issues are a concern to the general public. The applicants have a key role in promoting responsible gaming. And certainly it's important to protect and enhance the Massachusetts state lottery revenues. A couple of pictures from the hearings. Our first criterion is community support. You know, it's difficult to quantify community support because there are so many elements that make up this category. Certainly, each host community had strong community support, but there was opposition to both projects expressed as well. In Revere, we listened to 187 people speak in favor of the applicant, and we had 52 people speak in opposition, and there were 4 speakers who were neutral. In Everett, 110 people spoke to us in favor of the project, 31 in opposition, and 9 speakers who were neutral. And people were opposed and supported the projects for very different reasons, but we did hear from everyone and take all of those voices into consideration with our evaluation. So groupings of community support, we're talking about the mitigation-related portion of the host community agreements, the election-related materials from the host community agreements, public support and public outreach, the surrounding communities, as well as the regional venues known as the ILEVs. All of those were pieces of the community support category. We will start with Mohegan Sun in Revere, and in red, this is Revere, and all of the communities in blue have surrounding community agreements with the applicant. Boston, Cambridge, Chelsea, Everett, Lynn, Malden, Medford, Melrose, Revere, we just mentioned Revere, that's the host community. Salem, Saugus, Somerville, and Winthrop are all depicted on this map. In Everett, there are a couple of different, in red again, we see the host community. In blue, we see the surrounding community to include Cambridge, Chelsea, Malden, Medford, and Somerville. And outlined in black, we have adjacent communities that do not have agreements. Boston, Revere, and Saugus are outlined there. Now, with certainly we know with Boston, Boston declined to participate in the arbitration process, thus no agreement. Revere, through its own host community agreement, was precluded from entering into a surrounding community agreement. So I'm going to give you some ratings here, and then we'll talk a little bit more about it. With the host community agreements, each applicant received a very good. Each host community agreement that was approved by wide margins in those two communities, especially so in Everett. And what we decided not to do is really rate one agreement versus the other. They're individual, and we made the same decision. I made the same decision in the other evaluations we've done, because each community is different, each community's needs are different, and each community signed off and are very pleased with those agreements. In this particular case, we gave them each a very good. And as far as the election-related materials, they're each sufficient. They each supplied us with the necessary documents as required per the application. A little more about the host community agreements. So in Revere, a 63% favorable vote, 86% in Everett. Payments are somewhat similar. Advance payments of $33 million for Mohegan Sun and $30 million from Wynn to the city of Everett. This community impact fee may appear to be very different, but this first number, $25 million to Revere, is inclusive of a property tax commitment. And we'll see a 5.25 million community impact fee for Everett that is separate, and there's also a $20 million payment for property taxes. So when you do the math, they're very, very close, the dollar amounts agreed to for both communities. Next, we'll talk about community support to include public support and outreach. These are examples of a couple of charitable events that each of the applicants participated in. Mohegan Sun with an event with the Celtics, and Wynn Everett with an event with the Boston Pops. They are both sufficient. The applicant and Suffolk Downs have made strong efforts over the months conducting public outreach to local communities, including the host community. On the Wynn side, the applicant held numerous public information sessions in Everett, the North End, Charlestown, Medford, Cambridge, and elsewhere. The events and information sessions were publicized, maximum attendance, and there really was an awareness of what this project was all about. So they were both sufficient when it comes to public support and outreach. Moving on to surrounding communities, Again, as part of the legislation, we shall include a community impact fee for each, or definition rather, we shall include a community impact fee for each surrounding community and all stipulations of responsibilities between each surrounding community and the applicant, including stipulations of known impacts from the development and operation of a gaming establishment. Again, I rated them both sufficient in this area. A little different approach to surrounding communities, and we'll talk more about this later, but certainly Mohegan took a proactive approach to reach agreement and offered more generous mitigation payments. They reached agreements with all of their surrounding communities, but there was significant opposition from East Boston related to the relocation of the project, thus the sufficient rating. On the Wynn side, they took a more measured approach to surrounding communities, following the regulatory requirements. They reached surrounding community agreements and nearby community agreements with several cities and towns. They did enter into arbitration with 2 communities, and their offer was selected by the arbitrators. And as I just mentioned, Boston declined to participate in the arbitration process, both sufficient with surrounding communities. So I just mentioned iLev, that is an impacted live entertainment venue. Both, again, sufficient. Mohegan Sun has an agreement with City Performing Arts Center to manage their on-site venue, as well as an agreement with Mass Performing Arts Coalition. Wynn has an agreement with the Mass Performing Arts Coalition. So what both applicants did is they're using outside facilities. They do not have large facilities within their facility, so they are, in that way, they are protecting the iLevs. They're both sufficient in this way. So we're going to look at the community support overall rating here, and I've given them each a sufficient, and some of those factors for that rationale. Mohegan Sun, again, proactive approach to generating community support and executing surrounding community agreement, executed agreements with all the surrounding communities, faced opposition from East Boston and others. On the Wynn side, they undertook a comprehensive communications and outreach effort and received the highest percent of vote of any host community referendum. Measured approach to surrounding community negotiation, focused on the regulatory requirements. Some concerns have been raised, though, from Charlestown, Somerville, and Medford regarding traffic and other impacts. So each of them did some things very, very well, but as applicants around the state are finding, there's some opposition as well. Going to move on to criterion 2, which is traffic and off-site impacts. This is just an overview map of the region. I think what's noteworthy here is that, as we can see, this is a congested area. So we grouped the traffic and off-site impacts into three categories, and the impact assessments and costs to include the off-site infrastructure, utilities, and roadways. The traffic management plan is really mitigating the impacts of the added traffic, and other potential impacts, that's to include housing, school population, and emergency services. Give you some ratings, and then we'll get into the details here. With Mohegan Sun, they are solid, sufficient in their impact assessments and costs, in their traffic management plan and other potential impacts. Wynn Everett is insufficient with their impact assessment costs, insufficient with their traffic management plan, and sufficient with the other potential impacts. And we'll talk more about this in detail. Certainly the most important is the traffic management plan. That's the most critical, and we'll spend the most time talking about this. With regard to other potential impacts, both applicants' studies demonstrated no significant off-site impacts to schools, to housing, or to emergency services. Our consultants have done an independent analysis and find that it is unlikely that there will be a significant adverse impact to housing, schools in the area. And with regard to emergency services, potential issues that may arise, they are covered in host and surrounding community agreements. So each of them are sufficient with regard to this category. We'll move on. To the specifics here when we talk about transportation management. The first piece we're going to talk about is the regional access, and some of the rating factors are the adequacy of the study area, existing transportation systems, the trip generation and distribution, the identification of the impacts due to added traffic, and the mitigation measures proposed. So as we can see, this is all the regional roadways, and the two applicants are kind of right in the middle. One is kind of a red color on the right, that would be Revere, and Everett is a blue color on the left, right in the middle of that map. So when we talk about the study area for Mohegan Sun, 28 intersections in Revere, Boston, and Chelsea were studied. And those blue dots depict all of those intersections that were studied. Our traffic engineers determined that the study area was appropriate for this project. We're staying with the Mohegan Sun application here, and this is a map. We saw this in Site and Design. We talk about public transit here. It's a little hard to see, I realize that, but there's the blue line of the MBTA on the map, the 3 MBTA bus routes that serve the site, and what's important to note here is the applicant has invested $1.5 million, has agreed to invest $1.5 million to improve the MBTA Beachmont Station, which is adjacent to their pedestrian entrance, about 150 feet from the primary pedestrian entrance. So another important piece is the trip generation and distribution. The trip generation rate is based on two, this is from Mohegan now, based on 2 similar facilities. So they're trying to use something similar to draw conclusions here. The trip generation rate is 0.40 trips per gaming position for Friday peak. Friday peak is the day of the week and the time of the day in which casino traffic will overlap with commuter traffic. So that is the toughest, we base our evaluation on that day because that's when there will be the most impact with regard to this plan, this transportation management plan. The trip generation rate is inclusive of all uses on the site, and mass MassDOT satisfied with the trip generation rate here, and our traffic engineers found the rate to be acceptable as well. You've seen this map as well in the past, just really demonstrating how the prediction of how individuals will come to the casino and then will leave the casino. Okay, at this point, I would like to get into the more technical aspects of transportation management here, and I'm going to ask Jason Sobel, our traffic engineer from Green International, who is really our boots on the ground, really in the weeds when it came to these two applicants, to come up and give us a more detailed traffic analysis presentation here. Jason? I'll leave my stuff here.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Commissioners.
Good morning.
Melissa, can you go back to the previous slide? There's just a few points I'd like to add, some specifics with this slide. As Commissioner Cameron mentioned, the trip generation rate that was used was 0.4 trips per gaming position. And when Commissioner Cameron stated that that was inclusive of all uses on site, what that's really getting at is, you know, there's non-gaming uses proposed at both facilities, such as retail, restaurants, hotels, and the trip generation rate based on the gaming positions at Mohegan Sun was inclusive of all uses, so additional trips were not added on top of this vehicle trip generation calculation. That's going to be a distinction between the two applicants, so it's one of the reasons why I want to point it out here. The other point that I'd like to make on this slide is just to talk a little bit about the trip distribution and what the map is showing here. And what a trip distribution really is just how are people going to get there? What roads are they going to take? And as with many of the slides, some of these numbers are small and hard to see. But a key point here is the Mohegan Sun site is here. Route 1A is very close by. And 60 to 70% of the traffic is expected to use Route 1A to and from the south of the site towards Boston, including 44% on coming in from the Ted Williams Tunnel on the Mass Pike. The trip distribution patterns on the Sumner and Callahan and Route 16, they vary a little bit because of one-way tolling, whereas some traffic may be using the Callahan to go from Boston to the site, but then when people leave the site, they choose to avoid the tolls and use Route 16. All right, next slide. All right, this is a figure that was shown yesterday in Commissioner McHugh's presentation. And really the key points here are that there are really three vehicular access points. Tomasello Way at Winthrop, Furlong Drive that connects directly to Route 1A, and Tomasello Way continues south into Boston and also connects directly to Route 1A. One important point here is that Furlong Drive is going to be designed to accommodate all of the traffic using Route 1A. This is a conservative approach because it's likely that some traffic would use Tomasello Way to access Route 1A directly and not use Furlong Drive. So that was a positive. The next several slides, we're going to take a closer look at some of the more significant pieces of mitigation that are proposed. Before I start talking about these, I'll note that we're not going to cover every single proposed improvement by the applicant. You know, there was various mitigation proposed at many locations. We're only going to go through and highlight the most significant ones. And at all the other minor improvements. Those were all deemed to be adequate. All right, so what are we looking at here? This is Route 1A in the vicinity of the site. And just to orient ourselves, north is to the right of the slide, and it goes from top to bottom. So the southernmost portion of the corridor coming out of Boston is up here, and the Route 1A corridor continues northbound, continues north. There's some overlap. So in this area here is repeated of this intersection here. This intersection here is the Boardman Street intersection, which Commissioner McHugh discussed a little bit yesterday. It is the first signalized intersection along the Route 1A corridor coming out of Boston, and it's been a long, it's been a point of major congestion for a long time. So then we continue north along the site. This intersection here is Tomasello Way. Route 1A continues north and then continues along into the bottom portion of the slide. The intersection here is the intersection of Furlong Drive. And this stretch of Route 1A continues. Winthrop Ave is just off the slide here. So Mohegan Sun has proposed two alternatives for Route 1A mitigation. What we're looking at here is called the northbound flyover option. And essentially it would create grade separation and a ramp and allow northbound traffic on 1A to go over the Boardman Street signal and not have to travel through the signal. Mohegan Sun is only proposing to construct a flyover in the northbound direction. However, they have demonstrated that a flyover in the southbound direction could be constructed at some point in the future, and that this plan does not preclude that from happening at some point. Next slide. All right, the second option that Mohegan Sun proposes for Route 1A is called the at-grade alternative, and this is a similar orientation to what we were looking at previously, with the southern part of the corridor on the upper left and going north to the right, and then continuing in the middle section. Again, we have Boardman Street at this intersection here, Tomasello Way at this intersection, and Furlong Drive over here. To summarize, this option is everything would remain at grade without a flyover ramp, and instead a series of traffic signals would be proposed either at existing locations or at new locations. The key point here is that at all signalized intersections, there would not be any left turns allowed from Route 1A. This would allow each of the signals to operate more efficiently than the existing signals. And the applicant has agreed to construct either alternative. Ultimately, Mass DOT will select the preferred alternative, and in our opinion, either option adequately mitigates the traffic on Route 1A.
Could I ask a question on that?
Sure.
Jason? And you can tell me if you're going to address this later, or Commissioner Cameron will do that. But the two alternatives, they must have, I would imagine, different costs. Did you look at that?
They do have different costs. That was not something we focused on. The applicants, actually both applicants, have agreed. All the mitigation that's proposed, they've agreed to construct the mitigation, and they've provided cost estimates, but what we really focused on was whether or not the mitigation was adequate to mitigate their added traffic.
Okay. I was just wondering, well, I have this figure in my mind in the budget about what they included in their infrastructure spending, and I know they've made representations that it'll be whatever DOT will ask them to do. But I was wondering if there was one or the other included in
I believe the
budget.
cost estimates were for the flyover option.
For the
northbound
flyover,
option.
which is presumed to be the most expensive.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Jason?
Yes.
Just a couple of quick questions. It's mostly on the middle traffic project around Waldemar and Tomasello. When you have the northbound flyover alternative for Boardman Street, there's significant improvements you make coming up to Waldemar, but I don't see any improvements being made at Waldemar in the second scenario where there's no flyover. Help me understand the difference.
Well, Waldemar is an unsignalized location with right-in, right-out only.
Okay.
And really, the changes at that intersection are required with the northbound flyover option because additional right-of-way is needed, additional widening is needed to make room for the flyover, and therefore adjustments need to be made at the intersection.
Okay. And second question, moving further up 1A, you show improvements at Tomasello Drive, and we talked briefly yesterday about the applicant attempting to discourage use of Tomasello Drive, but yet some improvements are built into that.
At the at-grade alternative you're talking about now?
Well, they show improvements, it appears, to both.
In both. With the flyover option, Tomasello Way is sort of in the vicinity where the flyover comes back down and everything merges again together in the northbound direction with both the at-grade traffic from Boardman Street as well as the traffic that had gone over the signal. They come back together in this area, and the changes that are proposed at Tomasello Way in this alternative, Tomasello Way would be unsignalized and only a right turn exit is permitted. If this were selected as the preferred alternative, it's unlikely that exiting traffic from the casino would use this roadway because a lot of that traffic wants to turn left onto Route 1A southbound.
Okay. All right.
Whereas at the at-grade alternative, it would be a full signalized control and left turns would be allowed from Tomasello Way onto Route 1A.
Okay. Thank you.
So I have a question, and I'm sure everybody in the room who's followed this understands how this works, but particularly for remote viewers and for myself, could you explain how this flyover works? The diagram is not self-explanatory,
Sure.
at least to me. It may be to others more versed in these things.
All right, so the color coding here is everything highlighted in red would be new pavement. And as vehicles coming from Boston heading north, right in this area here, south of Boardman Street, there would be a split. So if you stayed to the left, you would go onto the flyover ramp and up over the Boardman Street signal. And then that would continue. You'd still be up above down here. You would not be able to access Waldemar or Tomasello because you would still be up on the flyover and then merge back onto the at-grade Route 1A in this area. If you wanted to access any of these side streets, there would be like an exit ramp right here at the southern end, right where the northbound flyover begins. You would have the option to take this off-ramp and approach the Boardman Street signal here to either turn onto Boardman Street, or you could continue straight through and then access Waldemar or Tomasello.
And so the red is the new pavement construction, and the green is what, Joseph?
Green is existing pavement that would be removed.
Be removed. Okay.
Right.
All right. That's helpful. Well, now let's just do the same thing with the next slide, because that one's a little more self-explanatory. But could you just do the same thing with that so that everybody's on the same page as to what's going to happen, or what's proposed?
Sure. In this alternative with the series of traffic signals, it's a little more familiar to people. This is the Boardman Street intersection, and that would remain signalized. A new traffic signal would be proposed here at Tomasello Way. This is an existing signal. It's an existing jug handle, which is essentially to allow southbound traffic to turn around and head back northbound. And in both alternatives, the intersection with Furlong Drive would be signalized as well. Now, the key thing here that I mentioned is no left turns would be permitted. So if you were coming from the north on Route 1A and wanted to get to Boardman Street, instead of turning left onto Boardman Street, you would have to go straight through the signal. There would be a new signal here to allow U-turns, and then you would head back north and make a right turn onto Boardman Street.
That's helpful. Thank you.
So what we're looking at here is the Route 1 and Route 16 interchange. This interchange actually straddles both the Chelsea and Revere city lines. It's in the line kind of goes right up the middle. North is to the top of the slide here. This road here that actually goes above is Route 1, and this is Route 16. And the proposed improvements here include 2 new traffic signals, one here and one here. And the purpose of this is really to improve access to both accommodate casino-related traffic as well as improve regional access. Under existing conditions, there's no easy way to get from Route 1 southbound to Route 16 eastbound. A lot of people come down here, and there's this traffic signal at Webster Ave just off this map where people have to come down and do a U-turn to head eastbound. Likewise, people coming from the east going westbound on Route 16, there's no easy way to get to Route 1 northbound. They come down to the same signal and do a U-turn to get to the ramp. So these proposed improvements include adding a few more connections to allow all movements at the interchange. And we find that these improvements would improve capacity and adequately mitigate the Mohegan Sun's traffic. What we're looking at here is Bell Circle in Revere. North is to the right here. This roadway is Route 1A. Route 1A actually continues off towards the northeast here, and the through movement continues as Route 60 through the city of Revere, ultimately connecting back to Route 1. The improvements here are, again, with the similar color coding with the red highlighting new pavement, is really minor widening in this area here. That right turn movement today, it's striped as a single lane. Sometimes, often during congested conditions, people squeeze in and stack up in 2 lanes. This would formalize that movement and improve capacity and safety and adequately mitigates Mohegan Sun's traffic. What we're looking at here, this is Copeland Circle in Revere. Again, north is to the right of the slide here. Copeland Circle is the interchange of Route 60 and Route 1. So this is Route 1 in this direction, with the Tobin Bridge further south off to the left. This is Route 60 that cuts through like this. As you can see, the existing Copeland Circle interchange is a very, very large rotary. The proposed improvements here include 3 new traffic signals within the rotary. This location, at this location, and at this location. And the idea behind these traffic signals is to control weaving movements. Now, what a weaving movement is in traffic terms is when traffic from one approach needs to shift over to the right to get to where they're wanting to go, and other traffic at the same time in the same area needs to shift over to the left to get where they want to go. So in this area, for example, traffic in the circle would want to shift to the right to exit, and meanwhile traffic coming into the rotary would want to shift to the left to stay into the rotary. So these traffic signals would prevent that conflict and control that conflict. So we find these improvements would improve capacity, safety, and adequately mitigate Mohegan Sun's traffic. All right, now moving on to the wind proposal in Everett. First, a brief overview. This figure shows the 57 intersections in the various municipalities that were studied in the draft environmental impact report. A more limited study area was included in the final environmental impact report, which is appropriate and common as projects move through the MEPA process. This slide shows the public transportation in the vicinity of the site, which is located here off of Broadway. I believe Commissioner McHugh had a similar slide in his presentation yesterday. In terms of public transportation, WIN is proposing to improve bus stops and bus shelters on Broadway and provide shuttles to and from the MBTA Orange Line stations at Wellington Station and Malden Center. They're not proposing to provide a shuttle to Sullivan Square. That would be, there's existing MBTA buses that travel right in front of the site along Broadway that connect to Sullivan Square already. All right, so a little bit about the trip generation and trip distribution. Similar to Mohegan Sun, the critical periods that were studied were Friday evening and Saturday afternoon, with the Friday afternoon peak hour being the more critical of the two. They did studies at two other similar facilities in Montreal and New York City to determine their trip generation rates. The trip generation rate that they used for Friday was 0.29 trips per gaming position. At first glance, this looks lower than the trip generation rate used for Mohegan Sun, although the difference in methodologies here is that additional vehicle trips were added for the non-gaming uses for the site. So there was the trips per gaming position, but then additional trips were added for the hotel, for the retail, the restaurants, and as a result, the trip generation rates ended up being similar to each other. MassDOT was satisfied with the trip generation rates, and so were we. Go back. To talk about the trip distribution a little bit and how trips are going to get there. Again, there's a lot of numbers on this slide. A key point is that approximately 2/3 of their traffic would be traveling south on Route 99 through Sullivan Square, and approximately 14 or 15% on Route 16 in either direction. So approximately 15% west of Sweetser Circle and approximately 14% east of Sweetser Circle on Route 16, which is the Revere Beach Parkway. This shows the site access. There's a single primary driveway for patrons with a secondary driveway further north on Broadway. There's MBTA bus stops on Broadway and shuttles to the Orange Line, which I mentioned, and pedestrian access both from Broadway, sidewalks along the site driveway, as well as connections to a harbor walk on the other side of the railroad tracks. The vast majority of employees would be parking off-site. The locations that have been identified are Malden Center Garage, Station Landing, right next to Wellington Station, and a third site in this area of Everett. The exact location hasn't yet been determined, and all employees would then be brought to the site via shuttle buses. Then we have the water transportation that Commissioner McHugh also discussed a little bit yesterday to downtown Boston and the World Trade Center in South Boston. In their latest environmental document, the final environmental impact report, 6% of patrons were assumed to be using water transportation and 3% of employees. Now, before we go to the next slide, similar to Mohegan Sun, we're going to focus on the more significant mitigation measures that are proposed. I'm not going to discuss all of the proposed improvements, just the more major ones, and the minor improvements that we won't get into. All of those were deemed to be adequate to mitigate their traffic. All right, so first we'll look at Broadway, Route 99 in front of their site. To orient ourselves here, north is to the right of the slide, and again, the top left is sort of the southernmost portion of the corridor. This is the city line between Boston and Everett. This intersection here is the preferred site driveway. As we head north, we pick up over here, and again, there's some overlap. The intersection just cut off here in the middle section is the same primary site drive intersection here. Broadway continues north, and again, this intersection here is repeated down here. This is the secondary driveway for service vehicles, and then Broadway continues north, and just at the northern end off the picture would be Sweetser Circle. So what's being proposed here is some roadway widening, 2 through lanes in each direction, turning lanes where needed, bicycle lanes in both directions, sidewalk improvements, bus stop improvements, as I mentioned previously. And we found that these improvements would improve capacity, safety, and adequately mitigate their traffic.
Jason, is it the same color coding as the previous applicant or not really?
Excuse me?
Is what's reflected in this slide number 40, the same color coding?
No.
Okay.
No, a lot of these figures came directly from
From
the
the applicant.
environmental filings from each applicant, so
Right.
they each used kind of different color coding. Here, the gray is proposed roadway, green is median islands in the middle of Broadway. All right, this is Sweetser Circle in the city of Everett. Sweetser Circle is just connects with Route 99 Broadway. The project site is located further south. What we're looking at here is Route 16, the Revere Beach Parkway. Route 99 continues through Everett over here. So the proposed improvements here are some minor widening on some of the approaches to the rotary, and improved signage and pavement markings within the rotary to clearly guide motorists, which is a significant improvement over the existing conditions with basically no pavement markings within the rotary. And we found that these improvements would improve safety and capacity and adequately mitigate their traffic.
Now, this we talked about a little bit yesterday, but this is the circle to the north of the site through which all southbound traffic has to go, right?
Correct. Approximately 1/3 of their traffic would be
Right.
traveling through Sweetser
Right.
Circle.
Right. So it's one of the 2 at either end of the site. Okay.
What we are looking at here is Santilli Circle. This is just west of Sweetser Circle, which we were looking at the previous slide. Sweetser Circle would be just off this slide here. This is also still in the city of Everett, and the proposed improvements here include the construction of a flyover ramp from Route 16 eastbound to this frontage road. The reason that's a critical piece is that there's no direct connection from Route 16 eastbound onto Sweetser Circle. So all eastbound traffic that would want to access the site needs to use this frontage road to get up onto Sweetser Circle. And this flyover ramp allows that traffic to make that movement without traveling through the 2 existing signals at grade. In addition to accommodating the casino-related traffic, there's a very significant volume of traffic making that movement today. And under the existing conditions, that traffic would have to make a right turn at this signal, go through the bottom half of the rotary, travel through the eastern signal, and then access the frontage road. So in addition to accommodating the casino traffic, there are hundreds of vehicles making that movement today. And as a result, the traffic signals can be retimed and re-optimized, and the operations will be significantly improved because all of that existing traffic is no longer traveling through those intersections. So we found that these proposed improvements would improve capacity, safety, and adequately mitigate their traffic.
There is, can I ask a question at this point? There's a major employer in that
Correct.
white box there. Does
So
this-
this area here is BNY Mellon. The area to the south is the Gateway Center with a lot of commercial shopping. And these proposed improvements would maintain access to all abutters and basically the same access that they have today. What we're looking at here is Wellington Circle in Medford. This is just west of Santilli Circle, just over the bridge. Let's see. So to orient ourselves, Route 16 is the east-west roadway here. East of Wellington Circle, it's the Revere Beach Parkway. West of Wellington, it is the Mystic Valley Parkway. Route 28, the Fellsway, is the major north-south roadway here. And the proposed improvements by WIN include some minor roadway widening to include an additional westbound through lane in the middle of the intersection, an additional eastbound through lane in this area, as well as an additional northbound left turning lane on Route 28. Furthermore, significant sidewalk and crosswalk and pedestrian improvements would be made as well to enhance pedestrian connectivity. And WIN has also agreed to participate in funding a study for long-term improvements at this location, although not committing to construct those improvements. And these improvements that are shown here on the slide, we found to improve capacity, safety, and we expect to adequately mitigate their traffic. All right. What we're looking at here is Sullivan Square in the city of Boston. The project site is just on the other side of the Mystic River to the north here along Route 99. This major roadway here is I-93, and we've got Cambridge Street. Moffat Way connects with Broadway into Somerville, and Rutherford Ave, Route 99 continues as Rutherford Ave south through Charlestown here. This is a critical location to the project. Again, I'll reiterate that approximately 2/3 of WIN's traffic will be traveling through Sullivan Square. As seen in this figure, the proposed interim improvements here really focus on the western portion of Sullivan Square without any improvements currently proposed on the eastern half. In addition to the roadway improvements, WIN is proposing to construct sidewalks and pedestrian connections to create, to allow an easily walkable connection from the Sullivan Square T station through along these roadways, along Alfred Street, over the bridge, and to their site. So we'll get into these proposed improvements in the next slide, but before we do that, I'll state that everything that I'm going to talk about today is based on what has been proposed in the final environmental impact report that was filed earlier this summer. Based on our discussions with MassDOT, it's possible that the applicant may change what they're proposing in a supplemental final EIR that they're required to submit through the MEPA process. So what I'm going to be talking about is the latest that we know now, although it could be subject to change.
And just so we understand the acronyms, MassDOT is the Massachusetts Department of Transportation, and MEPA is the thing that we were referring to.
MEPA is the Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act,
Right.
and the EIRs are environmental impact reports,
Right.
which all major projects need to go through the MEPA
Right.
process. All right, So this slide, again, to orient ourselves, this is a zoom in of what we were looking at the previous slide. We have Interstate 93 over here on the left, Rutherford Ave, Route 99 continues. The project site is further north over here. And what is being proposed here? The applicant is proposing widening on Cambridge Street with bike lanes in both directions. A significant piece of this is this roadway here. Under existing conditions, that is a busway which is not open to general traffic. It is only allowed for MBTA buses and employees. Under these proposed improvements, this roadway would be open to general traffic. As part of that, 2 new traffic signals are being proposed, one at Maffa Way at the northern end of the busway, and one on Cambridge Street at the southern end of the busway, and this is Spice Street. Additionally, a triple right movement is proposed from Cambridge Street into the Sullivan Square Rotary. And although the third right lane is only provided for approximately 200 feet, and some changes to the I-93 northbound off-ramp, which is in the lower left of this slide, some striping changes there to allow double right movement. Now, the most critical intersection is the signalized intersection of Cambridge Street and Maffa Way. We have large concerns with queuing on Cambridge Street past the northbound off-ramp, as well as queuing along Maffa Way back into the city of Somerville. We have some concerns and issues with the analysis that was presented at Cambridge Street with this triple right. Most people aren't familiar with driving through a triple right turn movement. There's not too many triple rights around here. And I'd expect that the third right turn lane would be vastly underutilized, and therefore the analysis presented by Wynn overstates the conditions here. And lastly, as I stated previously, no improvements are proposed along the eastern portion of Sullivan Square, notably at the Rutherford Ave intersection with the Rotary and Main Street intersection with the Rotary, both of which are unsignalized. So based on this analysis, it is our opinion that the proposed improvements, as shown in the final environmental impact report, do not adequately mitigate the traffic impacts from the wind development. At this point, I'd like to pass the presentation back to Commissioner Cameron to finish the presentation.
Before you leave, that was also the Secretary of Environmental Affairs conclusion with
Correct.
respect to the MIPA process. Is that right?
Correct. The MIPA certificate that Wynn received after the filing of their final environmental impact report requires them to come back, continue the MIPA process, file a supplemental final environmental impact report, in large part due to unresolved transportation issues.
With this as a central focus of those unresolved issues.
Precisely.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Commissioner McHugh, I think that's an important piece. The traffic mitigation at every other location, and there were, I'm trying to remember, very numerous intersection studies, is sufficient, is adequate. It's only here that that the mitigation is not sufficient. So all of the other mitigation, we've confirmed that it is sufficient to mitigate their traffic. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. Overall, we've gone through this, piece by piece, but overall, Mohegan Sun is sufficient. Some of the key factors there, they are. The site is well situated with multiple access points to Route 1A. The site is adjacent to the MBTA Blue Line station and bus routes, and adequate mitigation proposed on Route 1A and all other studied intersections. Key factors for the win: insufficient. The site is close to an MBTA orange line and regional roadways. Adequate mitigation proposed at studied intersections with the exception of Sullivan Square. And Sullivan Square mitigation in the short term is inadequate, and commitment to participate in a long-term solution is limited. Thus, the rating there. Any questions about that?
Can you explain the short term versus the long term a little bit
Yes.
better?
The short term, what we're talking about is, as Jason just explained, those lane markings, signals, in some cases road widening, median, that will be done immediately before the project opens. And long-term, we're talking about an overall total redesign for Sullivan Square, which has been in the works for years. And they have committed in a limited fashion to assisting with that project. And in a condition, we will propose at the end of this presentation, we will be addressing both long-term and short-term solutions.
So
Anything to add to that, Jason?
And the short term is also inadequate because, as Jason outlined, the proposed improvements deal with the east, not the west side, perhaps with some questions because of the 3-lane
Yes.
right turn queuing, etc. But it doesn't deal with the west side, with the east side.
Correct. There are,
Is that
they have failed to identify improvements on the one side, and the proposed improvements are not adequate.
okay?
So that's those two reasons why the short term is inadequate, is insufficient.
Okay. So you will be talking about the conditions later relative to both a short-term
We will.
solution.
We
and a
will.
long-
And the
okay, I'll wait.
supplemental will address that as well. That's, one of the reasons they are required to submit a supplemental to their final report is because they've been asked to address some of those issues.
And the supplemental submission is limited to traffic and is limited to Sullivan Square? Or
It's
are there
limited
other-
to the areas where MassDOT had issues with that. Jason, do you want to add to that?
The supplemental final environmental impact report will focus on Sullivan Square. I believe there are some other comments that they also need to address as well and respond to.
Related to traffic or other?
Mostly related to traffic and transportation.
Okay.
Any other questions before we move on to our next criterion?
I actually do. There were on slide, give me a minute. If we go back to slide 23, perhaps. The two. What would be the biggest difference
Yeah.
between, now, well,
Well-
let me back up a little. These three sub-criteria roll up to the one criteria on page 46. Is that a fair statement?
I'm sorry, will you repeat that question? Will the one?
Is what's highlighted here
Yes, in the rating?
in the ratings, is that sub-criteria that roll up to the criteria that we just
It
talked
is,
about?
it is. And I actually think it's a good question because I don't think I adequately explained to you why the insufficient rating with impact assessments and costs.
Yes.
So both of these insufficient ratings have to do with Sullivan Square.
Okay.
And when we talk about costs, it's our assessment that the costs to mitigate Sullivan Square in the short term are inadequate. The costs presented to us, thus the insufficient in impact assessments and costs. And the traffic management plan, certainly we spoke about at length why that is an insufficient rating, and it is all of those factors involving Sullivan Square.
Very good.
Anything else? We're going to move on to measures to mitigate problem gambling and promote responsible gaming. These are two of the brochures that I like to pick up when I'm at some of the off-site visits. This is one from Mohegan and another from Wynn, dealing with responsible gambling and problem gambling. So just some samples from their facility where they have them in locations where patrons can take a look, take one if they'd like. So one of the principal underpinnings of the Act establishes expanded gaming is the commitment to mitigate the negative and unattended consequences of casino gambling in the Commonwealth. So it really is incumbent upon our licensees to adopt policies and practices to address problem gambling and promote responsible gaming in every aspect of their operation. As you know, we've spent a lot of time with Director Van der Linden, going over some of these issues, deciding what we will mandate as regulators, and these questions really sought to seek our applicants' views, what they've done historically, direct and indirect measures, so we'll get into more of that. Again, this is not an isolated role for the licensees. They'll be working with government, science, industry, and gaming consumers to really play a role in what's the best way for all of us collectively to minimize these effects. Another important piece here when we talk about measures to mitigate is the Public Health Trust Fund. The fund will allocate significant dollars to a wide range of efforts and strategies to effectively minimize harm caused or exacerbated by gaming. And before I move on, Mark, do you have anything else to add to that before I get into the specifics?
No, I think that was good.
Okay. So these groupings of questions, we have three different categories. One is the direct efforts to mitigate problem gambling, promote responsible gaming. And what we're talking about with these direct efforts are the on-site resources for problem gambling, the self-exclusion policies, identification of problem gambling, credit extension abuse, and treatment and prevention. Under the processes and measures to mitigate problems, we looked at the Code of Ethics, metrics for problem gambling, and the historical efforts by these applicants in their other facilities against problem gambling. And indirect efforts were also part of this evaluation. And when we talk about indirect efforts, we're talking about advertising responsible gaming and problem gambling signage in facilities. So there were 10 separate questions that we evaluated. So the first group, as I just explained, what does the applicant do on site? And in some cases, what's their coordination with community providers to mitigate? And how do they train their employees? And self-exclusion is also a piece of these direct efforts, and that's when patrons voluntarily exclude themselves from the gaming facility. Group 2, what's their historical commitment in various ways to address problem gaming? And Group 3, how well did the applicants inform patrons about these issues? That's really what we're talking about. So, to summarize the questions and how we rated them, with the direct efforts to mitigate problem gambling, promote responsible gaming, Mohegan Sun is a sufficient to very good. With the second grouping of questions, the processes and measures to mitigate problems, Mohegan Sun is very good, and the indirect efforts to mitigate problem gambling and promote responsible gaming, Mohegan Sun is very good. It's how we rate it there, and I'll get into some specifics here. On the other side, Wynn is a sufficient in each of those three categories. With the first group, the direct efforts, Mohegan Sun demonstrated a commitment to addressing problem gambling, in many cases above and beyond the responsible gaming recommendations of the American Gaming Association. They have been actively working with the Gaming Commission to advance regulations, and their plan thoroughly describes linkage to treatment programs, but is less specific when describing initiatives for prevention. Overall, the sufficient, very good in that category. Wynn proposes and their policies and procedures conform with the American Gaming Association regulations, and they will work with us to develop strategies to minimize the harm of high-risk gambling. Sufficient, as we mentioned. Group 2, those processes and measures. Mohegan Sun demonstrated a history in addressing responsible gaming and supporting problem gambling services and research efforts. Comprehensive company expectations about responsible gaming. Wynn generally follows the accepted industry gaming practices. The Code of Ethics addresses aspects of responsible gaming and includes practices to promote responsible gaming. Again, sufficient. And in Group 3, Mohegan Sun describes specific and intentional efforts to develop a socially responsible marketing plan. They proposed a variety of signage and marketing products to reach patrons and employees, which is why they were very good. And Wynn provided an adequate approach to problem gambling signage, the Know Your Limits tag on player card, room keys, and brochures in the establishment. This tag is in line more with appropriately promoting responsible gaming than it does with raising awareness to problem gambling. So more detail, more historical efforts, and just an overall better response to these questions from Mohegan Sun, thus the ratings. So if we go to the overall rating here, Mohegan Sun is very good. They outlined a commitment to addressing problem gambling and promote responsible gaming, proposed multiple and creative strategies in numerous aspects of their operations. Wynn is sufficient. They will comply with our regulations and otherwise follow standard industry practices in the area of promoting responsible gaming and mitigating problem gambling at their facility. Mohegan Sun demonstrated a real understanding of the complexity of the problem and proposed to mitigate the impacts. Wynn's response generally lacked the detail and did not clearly articulate a depth of understanding of the issues. That's the responses to the questions that we had to evaluate. Any questions about responsible gaming and in our ratings here?
Was there consideration given to the different market strategy and business plan that the applicants bring, including the amount of money that they put towards training as part of these efforts?
I'm going to ask Mark to get into some more detail with that.
It was not specific that I saw in terms of what was the dollar amount that they put towards employee training and problem gambling, responsible gaming. Both applicants did address employee training. Mohegan Sun provided significantly more detail in terms of what types of employee trainings that they would provide, and when was a little bit more general in how deep they went on that specific issue.
Thank you.
I may have misunderstood the question, but I thought it was focused on, was any adjustment to the evaluation made given the marketing plans of the two entities, i.e. a win plan that looks for higher end, more affluent, I suppose, players than the Mohegan Sun plan, at least on the surface, appears to.
So just generally, when described their Know Your Limits campaign and where they would put that, they described where they have put the information about problem gambling or where to seek access for help, i.e. the helpline number. Whereas, it didn't expand beyond that, where Mohegan Sun provided a much more in-depth description of where and how they would promote responsible gaming, and direct patrons for resources for problem gambling. And they went into a lot of detail about the signage and methods that they would do that. I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, my question really focuses on whether, I guess, there's a difference in the approach one takes, whether general research makes any distinction between the kind of approach one takes to, say, high limit players as opposed to day-to-day players.
Yeah.
Just in a general sense.
Yeah, and neither of the applications really address that aspect.
Does the research in the field address that?
Not that I've seen, no.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll move on to our last criterion, which is to protect and enhance the lottery. So the statute made this a key provision in Massachusetts. The Massachusetts revenue per capita for lottery spending is very high. We have the most profitable lottery in the country, and it's important to preserve that revenue and add to it with gaming facilities. Thanks. Both applicants are sufficient in this category. Mohegan Sun, the applicant provided a comprehensive strategy to promoting the lottery. They have an executed agreement with the Mass State Lottery, and the applicant is committed to the installation of terminals. With Wynn, the applicant also has a strategy for promoting the lottery. As of last Friday, I'm going to update this slide. This went to production before we learned last Friday that Wynn does have a commitment, a signed agreement with the lottery. We heard from the Wynn folks as well as the lottery folks to confirm this. And again, they have committed to the installation of terminals as well. So both sufficient, both will do what the law requires with regard to protecting and enhancing the lottery.
Just a quick question. And I think you're right, this is more of, I think you've described it as the check-the-box questions.
For the most part, but you'll remember
Yeah.
up in Springfield, MGM actually came up with a very creative idea to add to the end of a sequence on a slot machine. Would you like to buy a lottery ticket?
Right.
So they actually were rated higher because of that creativity, and the lottery confirmed that they were impressed with that idea, and they're working on technology to see if they can make it happen.
Okay.
So In this particular case, they are both sufficient, and it can be looked upon as a check the box, but in the case of MGM, we did give them additional credit for really coming up with a creative idea. Okay, so without any more questions, and I did fail to ask of you if you had questions, and I'm sure none of you are shy, so if you had them, you may have already asked, but I'm happy to take questions regarding community support if you had some from that category.
I had a quick question. While my colleague looks for his question, you talked about Mohegan Sun, and obviously there was opposition. And I think you stated from East Boston and others, and I wasn't quite sure who the
Well, initially,
Others identified
there was, quite a bit of opposition in Winthrop, mostly regarding traffic issues. So there were, we all sat through those community hearings. There was opposition from others expressed at each of those hearings, which is why it was difficult for either candidate or either applicant to reach a higher rating, because as we continue to hear from residents, there is opposition to both projects.
Okay, thank you.
I actually had a clarifying comment. Maybe it appeared on slide 20.
120, yeah?
And would it be, we don't necessarily have to go there, but it's a slide where you rate them both sufficient. And the question applies to both, really. Would it be fair to say that, at least in this criterion, you make no judgment as to the amounts of the surrounding community payments, but rather the notion that they followed a procedure, established an agreement, et cetera?
Well, I did make a judgment that although they went about those agreements in different methods, they were both sufficient. Again, arbitration is part of the process. We decided early on not to look at arbitration as any kind of a negative, and so we did the same with our evaluation here. We did not look at that as a negative if one community ended up in an arbitration process. In this case, there were a couple. So yes, we didn't look at them individually as far as, because every community is different and their needs are different. The same with the host community. So we didn't add up dollar amounts. We didn't think that was an equitable way to assess the process.
Very good.
It's fair to say, though, is it not, that with respect to the Wynn proposal, the political leadership, at least, of Somerville is not supportive of the proposal.
That is fair to say.
And it's the Boston political leadership has indicated some unhappiness with the proposal. That's a
Yes.
purposeful understatement.
Yes, I would agree. And we had, Commissioner McHugh, we had long discussions about whether or not it was appropriate to look at that in a negative light at all. And I made the judgment not to do so, because we have secondhand reports of what may or may not have transpired in those negotiations. None of us were a party to those negotiations. I'm talking about the Boston negotiation, which, in the process, Boston declined to move forward with arbitration. And for those reasons, I did not deem that it would be appropriate to, in any way, hold, to make a judgment, an affirmative judgment on fault or blame because of those
Right.
lack of details.
No, and I understand that. I'm just trying to make sure that I understand facts rather than motives. But the final one that I wanted to ask about is that Chelsea does have a surrounding community agreement with the Wynn, but the city manager of Chelsea appeared in support of the Everett proposal and did not appear in support of the Wynn proposal at our final public hearings, if my memory serves me. Is that right?
I believe that is an accurate
Right.
statement, and again, it's hard to know the reason for that, other than obviously they like one proposal better than
Right.
the other.
Right, right. Okay. Thank you.
Commissioner, if I could just note that Chelsea was another arbitration, and there was an agreement reached by the arbitrator, but in the end, there was no executed agreement by the city of Chelsea pursuant to our regulations. The arbitration report was deemed to be the surrounding community agreement.
Right. Ombudsman Ziemba has been more precise than I was. The agreement with the city of Chelsea came about through arbitration and was not a voluntary agreement between the Wynn entity and the city. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. So overall, ratings. We have a sufficient rating for Mohegan Sun with community support. We have a sufficient rating for Mohegan Sun with traffic and off-site impacts. We have a very good rating when it comes to measures to promote responsible gaming, and a sufficient rating with the lottery. And with Wynn, we have a sufficient rating with community support, an insufficient with traffic and off-site impacts, a sufficient rating with measures to promote responsible gaming, and a sufficient rating with the lottery. I have some, next. I'm not going to read all of these comments, but I do have some overall observations about these two applicants with regard to mitigation. So overall, ultimately, the overall rating for mitigation can be tied to the different approaches each applicant took to responding to questions in each of the subcategories. Mohegan Sun was more proactive and responsive in each area, while Wynn was more measured and followed the regulatory requirements in their responses. On the host and surrounding communities, both received strong support as well as neighboring opposition. Mohegan Sun reached more agreements and offered more mitigation and funding than Wynn. But on balance, both applicants met the acceptable criteria threshold. On mitigation of transportation impacts, Mohegan proposed multiple options to adequately mitigate impacts and committed to doing whichever was preferred. In contrast, Wynn took a more limited approach throughout the MGC application process and the state MIPA process. Wynn was encouraged to provide and given opportunities to provide detail on its traffic mitigation plans, but submitted information that did not fully address or mitigate its traffic impacts on the region. The lack of specifics of full mitigation commitments on this critical evaluation point resulted in Wynn's insufficient rating in this area. On measures to promote responsible gaming and address problem gambling, the divergent approaches to addressing issues and responding to application questions was also evident in each of the applicants' attention and response. Mohegan's responses acknowledged that the circumstances of these two conditions, talking really about the difference between problem gaming and responsible gambling, responsible gaming and problem gambling. And they need to be addressed independently and provide specific and creative methods and tools for doing so. Wynn's response was more general and committed to following industry standards without providing a significant distinction. And with the lottery, they each were sufficient and provided what they needed. They have the agreements in place. So overall, that summarizes my ratings here. And I'll take questions before I get into a proposed condition.
Will the condition take long or to go through?
I think
I
your
was-
question is well taken, Commissioner, and we probably should take a break before we start with the condition.
I drink a lot of coffee in the
Commissioner
morning, and
McHugh, would you agree?
I always need a break right about
Now,
now.
I could sense that embedded in that question. So we'll take a 10-minute break and then resume. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, we're set to resume now, and if you'd take your seats, we'll do so. We're going to resume and finish now the mitigation section with a discussion, presentation, and then any questions about the conditions that Commissioner Cameron has for the mitigation area. Commissioner?
Yes. Thank you, Commissioner McHugh. Okay, so we went through the presentation, and we do have recommended conditions for the mitigation category, and I'm going to proceed with those at this time. So just as a little background information, again, this is the existing conditions at Sullivan Square now, this photo, and as we pointed out, as background, we pointed this out in the presentation, the current short-term solution, the final EIR, did not adequately mitigate casino traffic in Sullivan Square. Full short-term mitigation should be accomplished through further physical improvements and/or reductions in casino traffic. There are limitations to the extent and effectiveness of additional physical improvements, i.e. lanes, signals, noted by MassDOT and MAPC. A long-term solution is under development by the City of Boston to improve Sullivan Square. The long-term solution is unfunded and estimated to cost in excess of $100 million. And to be clear, long and short-term mitigation must emphasize traffic reduction in addition to physical improvements. And just a note with regard to background as well, I think it's important to note that comments from MassDOT and MAPC, Sullivan Square mitigation is a regional transportation issue. The square itself is in Boston, but it really is a regional access issue. Impacts people, 93, how people get in and out of the metropolitan area. So just want to make that clear that it's a regional issue. We are proposing to include the best and final offer, the BAFO that was submitted by Wynn to Boston, which would have been part of the arbitration process. That didn't happen, but it's our recommendation that those elements of the best and final are included in this condition. And to highlight those elements, it's a $750,000 upfront payment and a $1 million annual payment for public safety needs. It's a $250,000 upfront payment and a $1 million annual payment for traffic improvements. It's a $250,000 annual water transportation payment, a $350,000 annual community mitigation payment. Wynn shall use good faith efforts to purchase goods and services from Boston businesses of at least $15 million annually. Wynn shall use cross-marketing to promote Boston businesses and attractions. Wind shall use good faith efforts to create a Boston construction and operations hiring preference. Wind shall support Boston funding requests for problem gaming. And Wind shall reimburse Boston's reasonable consulting cost related to impacts. So those were all offered in the best and final, and we are proposing that they be part of this condition.
Commissioner, can I ask a question on that?
Yes,
Briefly.
Commissioner, you may.
The second bullet says there's an upfront payment and an annual payment for traffic improvements. Is that in excess, separate and in excess of what was described before on the west side of the short-term
Well,
improvements?
this was part of, this was, yeah, kind of a generic payment to the city, which could be used for a number of different areas, or it could be used toward a long-term solution. So it is not specified as to
Okay.
what it would be used for.
Okay. And the second to last bullet says there's a Wind supports Boston funding request for problem gambling. Is there an estimation of that number, or how is that determined?
I don't believe there's anything more specific than that. These are the elements of that agreement, so it would be an issue that they would need to work out.
Right. But in either case, it came from the applicant. It came from Win in the
Well,
best and final offer?
It did.
Okay.
All of these elements came from Win in their best and final.
And I take it, just to follow up on this, I take it that that recommendation is based on the notion that as a commission, we are limited to imposing mitigation payments as opposed to something else. And these would have been the minimum mitigation payments that would have emerged from the arbitration process had it been followed. I take it that's the rationale for this.
It is. It is the reason we included this as part of the condition.
Okay.
So, with regard to the traffic mitigation at Sullivan Square, again, this is these are photos of, here is the short-term, Mr. Sobel went over this at length, the short-term proposals that have been made by Win, again, nothing on this side. And a long-term is really a total redesign of Sullivan Square. So that's an example of a long-term solution on the right. So with this condition, in addition to the BAFO-related conditions, the draft conditions require, these proposed that we're proposing, that Win is to complete the MIPA process and receive permits for short-term mitigation at Sullivan Square by July 1 of 2015. Win is to mitigate the impact at the intersections of Main and Rutherford Ave with Sullivan Square, regardless of whether MIPA requires such mitigation, provided that the City of Boston requires such mitigation. Win to develop and update a plan to improve public safety vehicle access in Sullivan Square, Rutherford Avenue area. Win to comply with its stated goals for alternative modes of transportation, public transit, boats, in the recent MIPA filings. Win proposed that 29% of trips will take alternative transportation. And the Commission can enforce such conditions through measures such as reduction in the use of spaces in Win's on-site garage and/or variable pricing in Win's garage. Question?
Well, I have a question, but I'm going to hold that question until
Okay.
you do the next.
All right,
the
great. There
next
is a
slide.
second part to this.
Yeah.
And tell me if that applies to my question as well. I feel I'd like to understand the second point here a little better. I'm not sure I get.
Okay,
Or
the
could you
second
point- would
point
you
to
point-
mitigate intersections of Main Street and Rutherford Ave,
Yes.
that is obviously the other side. the additional work that needs to be done, as well as, we thought it was important that this be done whether or not MIPA addresses it. We thought it was important that if the city of Boston wants this mitigation, that Wynn agree to do this mitigation, to comply with that request.
Is this the east side of Sullivan Square of the short-term solution? Is that a fair statement?
It is the east side, yes. So it's,
I take it it's unlikely that this will be untreated in the MIPA process. So this condition is
Yes.
there in the event,
yes, and
probably
that's-
unlikely.
That's a good point,
that it-
Commissioner,
it
that
emerges.
Thank you for clarifying that.
we, I guess anticipate is a good word to use with regard to this, but if for some reason it doesn't happen, it's really important that that mitigation take place,
If the city wants it.
if the city wants it. Yes, that's correct.
And would it be similar to what they propose in the west side, or we simply don't know, don't have that information?
You know, let me turn to my traffic experts to assist with answering that question. I know there was some stipulation early on as to what could be proposed. Jason?
And before you go there, Jason, just generically, I was thinking, you know, some lane widening, signaling, striping, is that what we mean in general?
Yes, that is correct, that is the general thought there for mitigation at those two intersections.
Right.
But we're not, this condition doesn't presuppose that we're going to prescribe what it's going to look like, right?
Correct.
This
Yes.
is left to others.
That's right.
Either MIPA or the city of
Correct.
Boston.
Yes.
Okay, we'll move on to the next part of this Sullivan Square condition. Wynn is to pay 10% of the cost for a long-term Sullivan Square Rutherford Ave plan, provided that it is designed to accommodate casino traffic. The 10% is the projected amount of traffic from the casino during the Friday peak hour. The 10% is capped at $20 million, reflecting that the cost of the long-term solution may grow more than the current estimate of $100 million. The 10% is in addition to the $1 million annual transportation payments specified in the Wynn BAFO. Each year, Wynn is to pay $20,000 for each vehicle trip above the number of peak hour vehicle trips determined through the City of Boston's roadway improvement permit process. That's hard to understand. An example of this would be if Wynn's peak hour traffic exceeds approved estimates by, say, 200 vehicles, Wynn would have to pay an additional $4 million annually. That would be the $20,000 times the 200 vehicle overage. However, if Wynn is successful in not exceeding traffic projections, such annual payments may not be required. I think it's important to point out here that we're really looking at a mitigation measure here. We're looking at reducing traffic through Sullivan Square with this piece of the condition. And finally, Wynn may petition the commission to refund any unused funds in the long-term solution if not commenced within 10 years of the casino opening. So these payments would, these mitigation payments would be put in a fund for the long-term solution. And, you know, we think 10 years is the appropriate time frame on those monies. If there is not, if that project hasn't commenced, we could be petitioned to, in fact, return those unused funds.
So the $20,000 per vehicle funds, if I understand this correctly, would go into a fund along with the $10 million up to $20 million that would be set aside to pay the wind share of the long-term solution. Is that right?
That's correct, Commissioner, and we have a more specific example later in the presentation that will illustrate that to a more complete example we'll provide.
Okay, so I did have a question now that relates the last slide with this slide. In the last bullet of the last slide, it says wind to comply with its stated goals for alternative modes of transportation. That is, the 29% of the trips will take place through alternative modes. This bullet on slide number 5 that deals with the $20,000 per vehicle, that's in parallel to the mode share allocation talked about in the last slide. Is
That's
that right?
correct.
So somehow the two have to interface smoothly, and I take it our more detailed plan explains
We
how
will.
that- how they will.
We'll give you a better example
Right.
in just a minute that will explain that better. Again, what's important here is that the commission is creating tools to encourage wind to reduce the number of vehicles traversing through Sullivan Square. This is not meant in any way to penalize wind for being successful. It's meant to recognize that additional traffic above projections will have an impact on the region.
But I guess the point I'm trying to raise is that if the 29% produces a traffic yield in excess of the yield that was the basis for the permits that were issued, then the $20,000 applies even though the 29% has been met. Right?
The 29,000.
If the 29%, let's make it simple. Suppose the number of cars per hour used as a basis for permitting the construction in Sullivan Square is 100 cars per hour. But 29% is 110 cars per hour. Turns out to be 110 cars per hour. The $20,000 per car would apply to the 10 cars over 100.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay,
Yes. So you're right. Those two pieces are intersecting.
right,
I see your point now.
right.
Yes.
Okay.
And tell me if we're going to get to this in the example, but are we reasonably comfortable that the casino traffic can be, that goes through Sullivan Square can be identified and isolated?
Good question. I asked the same question of our engineers, and they assure me that that is very doable, that there is a way to do that makes perfect sense. And we'll have a little more explanation with that as well.
Because there could obviously be additional development around, say,
Right.
Assembly
No, there's-
Square.
Good question, and we will explain that a little further in the
Okay.
example we get to.
Okay.
Okay, so we're going to move on to a part of the condition that deals with parking. And what we'd like here is for Wynn to prepare a report for review by the commission identifying the appropriate number of parking spaces in the underground garage on the site, and submit that draft report to the commission no later than 30 days after the award of the license.
Can I ask, why did you feel this was a necessary condition, Commissioner?
Well, yes, you may. The DEIR count was, and that's the draft, was 2,800 to 2,900 parking spots. And then the final report increased parking to 3,700. And we want to confirm what the comfortable number of parking spots is. And we think a little more analysis there would be helpful. In doing that, there are many ways to look at parking. And so we think because of the difference in the two reports, we'd really like to look at this and have a report prepared for us that addresses this issue.
Okay, thank you.
So next, we have, as part of the condition, an outreach piece, and that is that WIN shall engage in community outreach to Charlestown and report to the commission on such outreach. Obviously, Charlestown residents have been very vocal and have strong ideas about, since it is, Sullivan Square is how they enter and exit the neighborhood. So we really want to see that community outreach to Charlestown. And as far as the site cleanup, we saw this depiction earlier. This is the proposed site mitigation for the cleanup at the WIN facility. And we just want to ensure that WIN implements a public participation program per the mass contingency plan for this cleanup, and have a draft plan in place no later than 30 days after the award of the license, and really include officials, public officials in this process: Everett, Boston, Somerville, and interested parties in Charlestown in the initial mailing list. So this piece of the condition really does deal with outreach and communication, and so residents have an idea of what's going on, and there is that dialogue.
I take it that the draft plan is a draft plan for the public participation, not a draft plan for the final details of the cleanup.
That's correct. Oh, that's correct, yes.
Okay. And the public participation program is the one that's required by the regs and specified in the regs?
Yes.
Okay.
We just,
All right.
there were, as you know, Commissioner, there were many questions about the site cleanup, and that communication, that public participation will be helpful.
Right, right. And is a customary part of these cleanup plans. What then is the outreach in the first bullet a reference to? Does that have to do with the
because
cleanup, or?
I think that's an overall outreach, because Sullivan Square is, it's not only regional, but it's personal with many Charlestown residents, really engaging the residents in what these mitigation measures are, what will be happening, is a piece that we thought was important. So that's an overall outreach through this entire process. Do we have anything to add to that, our traffic experts?
Okay, all right. Perhaps we could talk a little bit more about that tomorrow.
Yeah, right. I guess I just want to pose a question, which we can talk about tomorrow. Are we comfortable that would be something we could be measuring?
Measuring the outreach
the
piece?
efforts, yeah, the efforts on behalf. I guess we did that to a great degree in all the efforts that get the applicants to this point, but.
Again, without the surrounding community agreement with the city of Boston, we're really trying to look at every aspect and make sure we're hearing people, we understand what the issues are, and what is the best way we can ensure that the process is participatory and that
Okay.
folks know what is being proposed. We're also proposing a look-back study as part of this condition. Other mitigation may be required as a result of a look-back provision similar to that adopted by MGM, Penn National, and WIN's agreement with the City of Malden. WIN is required to pay for an independent study of specified impacts during the construction period, after 1 year of operation, and then after 5 years of operation. Upon the issuance of the report, WIN is required to work with the City of Boston to determine appropriate mitigation, and if necessary, proceed to arbitration if necessary. And the look back will apply to public safety impacts, non-Rutherford Ave, Sullivan Square related traffic impacts, water, sewer, stormwater, construction noise, and the Ryan Park construction and traffic impacts. So we have specific conditions with regard to Sullivan Square. This is a look back at all of those other areas that make up the mitigation category.
So the stormwater impacts, for example, that applies to everywhere that they make an improvement, or is it the site, or is it Sullivan Square?
We didn't get into specifics with that. Usually in these kinds of look-back studies, it's non-specific because you really don't know. That's
Okay.
the reason for the look-back study. So these are the general areas that we'd like to be studied, and we'll have a report.
But these would only be impacts attributable to
The casino.
WIN's activities.
Correct.
Right.
Oh, correct,
So-
absolutely.
If it rained a
Specific
lot,
to their
I mean,
activities,
If it,
yes.
if it rained a lot,
Yeah.
they wouldn't be responsible for that.
No. No. Okay, so this is the more specific example that I mentioned earlier. I'm going to ask Rick Moore, who has helped us develop this condition, to come up and speak more about one of our consultants with City Point Partners, come up and speak to the specific example here that will give us an idea of what numbers could possibly be. Rick?
Thank you, Commissioner. Good morning.
Good morning.
Because there's some uncertainty about what the final mitigation would be, we created this example to try to get our hands around some of the variability in the actual numbers that could result in this condition. And I'd like to walk you through sort of the four main components of the mitigation. And again, this focuses exclusively, essentially, on Sullivan Square. The first line talks about the short-term solution. Now, this is the short-term solution we've just been talking about. It's the brick and mortar changes and the signal changes to the Cambridge Street and Moffett Way intersections, and it could change over time as it's more developed in the MIPA process and finally permitted by the City of Boston. It could include, as you mentioned, Commissioner, some changes on the east side of the intersection, perhaps some changes to the geometry and signalization of what's already been proposed. But based on what we have, we think $6 million is a reasonable number for this mitigation, the short-term mitigation. The important distinction on this slide is that $6 million is what you might call a sunk cost. It will be invested in the short-term solution before the casino is opened, as opposed to the rest of the numbers we'll be talking about, which are generally payments to the City of Boston that will occur over the life of the license. So the second line is one of those payments, and this is just brought forward from what Commissioner Cameron was talking about in terms of the best and final offer. It's $1 million a year for the 15-year term of the license. And this money, as you questioned earlier, is over and above the short-term solution brick and mortar cost. And it can be used for other improvements, transportation improvements, or, as alluded to earlier, it could be banked over the course of that time for payment for the long-term solution. So the city has some flexibility in how they use this payment. Now, the third line is perhaps the most complicated and variable, and that's the traffic reduction incentive payment concept. And this is really, as was previously mentioned, an incentive to keep WIN to their commitments in how much traffic they can divert, how much of their patrons they can divert to public transportation. And if you look at the short-term solution, as was talked about before, each solution has embedded in it an assumption on a mode split. How much of the patrons will come by public transportation and how many will come by vehicles. In the case that we have before us now, that was in the final EIR, the short-term solution presented by WIN, their assumption is that approximately 30%, 29, but approximately 30%, this is not, I'll caution you, an exact science, approximately 30% of the patrons will come by public transportation. You know, that's the train, buses, the water transportation, bikes, or by foot. And about 70% will come by vehicle. Now, if you take that 70% and you divide it by the way people will come to the site, you'll recall that about a third of that 70% will come from the north, and about 2/3 will come from the south, through Sullivan Square. So you can make a calculation at the Friday peak hour, which is the critical time, and you can convert that percentage into an actual number of vehicles that are coming out of the facility and going through Sullivan Square. Think of that number as the allocation that the casino has to provide traffic to Sullivan Square. Now, if you assume that that allocation, that 70% converted into a specific number, will be mitigated by the short-term solution, that's the assumption that WIN has made in their final EIR. The Commission, and in fact the City of Boston and others, have suggested that the mode share be measured after the casino is put in operation to make sure that that split is actually happening. So what would happen, and as was mentioned just a minute ago, we can measure the number of trips that are coming to and from the casino through Sullivan Square. Because if you take a right-hand turn out of the casino, there's pretty much only one place you can go, and that's Sullivan Square. And again, if you're coming north from Sullivan Square and making a left into the casino, we can measure that traffic. So we can get a number of vehicles in the first year of operation, for example, and compare that number to the 70% number, 70% allocation that was predicted. The condition is saying that if the traffic exceeds the number by one vehicle, you would pay $20,000 per vehicle for that exceedance. And that is the incentive, to have the casino come up with a plan in the face of that incentive to get that traffic to where they projected it would be, 70%. Now, it becomes a little bit complicated now because, as you also heard, the Commission is not comfortable that the short-term solution will actually mitigate that 70% traffic. And this was echoed in the comment letters in the MEPA process by both the Department of Transportation and by the City of Boston and by others. So what the Commission said, in order to get their hands around this problem, they said, all right, if you impose that short-term solution that we've just been talking about, how can you mitigate the traffic? And there's two ways to mitigate traffic. You can either put brick and mortar, or you can reduce the traffic by traffic mitigation and transportation demand management. So the Commission said, let's freeze the short-term solution and see if there's a way we can reduce the traffic, get more traffic onto public transportation, and can we make that mitigation work? So there was some traffic analysis done, and essentially there was a consensus in discussing this, that if you move that 70% number down to about 45 to 50%, that short-term solution would work. So you see you have a blend here. You have a brick-and-mortar solution and you have a transportation demand management plan, and they have to work together. So what the Commission is saying, in order to get their hands around this, is if you use that short-term solution and you reduce the number of vehicles on the road by transferring to public transportation, you can make this work and you can mitigate the traffic. Now, it so happens that when you go from the 70% down to about 45 to 50%, that equates to approximately removing 200 vehicles from Sullivan Square, and that's the 200 vehicles you see on the fourth line. So let's continue this line of thinking. Let's assume in the first year of operation, Wynn can get down to the 70% number that they've advertised. But they can't get to the new threshold that we think is necessary, which is another 200 vehicles. And so therefore, the incentive plan would say they have to pay the $20,000 for that 200 vehicles that they cannot transfer from the road to public transportation. Now, if you carry it out for the 10-year span, and you assume those two numbers don't change for that entire 10 years, you get $4 million the first year and $4 million each of the 10 years for a total of $40 million. Now, the incentive, obviously, is to do just that, is to incentivize Wynn to get closer to the 40% to 45 to 50% than the 70%. And as they did certain mitigation measures to get closer to the new goal, which is 45 to 50%, they could reduce their payment over the course of time. So this is a variable number each year as you measure the traffic. In this particular example, we're kind of freezing it to make it simple and saying that if they can only get to 70 but not to the 45 or 50 for that 10-year period, it would be a $40 million payment, $4 million a year. But in reality, it will be a variable payment. And in fact, the real reality is that the short-term solution and the mode split that we've just been talking about is in the process of being further evaluated through the MEPA process and eventually the permitting that the City of Boston resolves with Wynn. In that permit, there will be an actual short-term solution, perhaps similar to the one we have now, and a companion mode split that goes with that. Those two characteristics will form the basis for the threshold that will be measured against each year. And if that threshold is exceeded in terms of mode split, there'll be a payment. If that threshold is not exceeded, there will not be a payment. And
Okay.
so that is,
Let me just...
yeah,
I-
take questions.
I want to just to pick up on that last point, because we're talking about, as the example proceeded, we're talking about a number, a target number that the commission would pick. You used as an example 45%. It's the target number really is a number that's going to be determined by the MEPA process and ultimately by the City of Boston MassDOT permitting process, right?
Correct.
Right. So the commission is not now, if it adopts this condition and applies it, is not now going to say, this is your target number. That target number will be left to the process that is normally used for assessing capacity and demand.
Correct. This is basically an
Okay.
example based on what we know
Right.
today.
Okay. Thanks.
I'd like to understand the unit of measure that ends up with the 200 in your example. Is this vehicles per hour during peak time, Friday at between 5 p.m. and 6 p.m.?
Correct.
So it's an actual count between that hour?
Yes. And the actual payment will be based on number of vehicles, not a percentage, because it's the number of vehicles that is important in the traffic analysis.
So conceivably, Wynn could offer, I don't know, free parking or a free buffet. They don't have a buffet, but, free coupons if you arrive before 4 o'clock, let's say.
Correct. There's an.
It expires after 5, because otherwise we are in the, so there's operations, in other words, that the applicant, not just in the mode split, but there's operational incentives or disincentives that the applicant could use to deal with this.
And a casino, based on their particular operation, has more flexibility than, say, an office building where
Correct.
people would generally have to come at peak hours.
Right.
Any other questions on this? Because this is a moving target.
Go ahead.
The last line is the long-term solution, and as the Commissioner just mentioned, the condition here is 10% of whatever the cost will be, and ultimately, the City of Boston will develop that cost as they move through the process, but they currently estimate it to be $100 million. We know that'll go up over time, but we want to put a cap on it. 10% is the amount of traffic that Wynn will contribute to Sullivan Square in the future, and therefore the 10% is the basis of that calculation. And therefore you get a fairly good range of $10 to $20 million. That's a fairly good range as a top and a bottom. One more point about the sample over the traffic reduction incentive payment. It could be zero, obviously, is a low number. The $40 million is not intended to be a cap. It could go higher than that, but it's our judgment that it's reasonably close to a cap. So if you add all the numbers together, you get a range of somewhere in the neighborhood of $30 to $80 million over the course of the license. And as the last three bullets mentioned, the variation will depend on the actual cost of the long-term solution. That's the $6 million. We don't expect that to vary dramatically. The actual traffic reduction compared to Boston's permitted numbers, which is what Commissioner McHugh was alluding to a minute ago. And lastly, the design estimate for long-term solution, which we will anticipate to get from the design process that the City of Boston will entertain.
So this is a range for the overall cost, right? To get to the 31, we add the BAFO and 10 million
Right.
from the long-term solution, right? And to get to the 81, we add the outer limits. Only one of them is not capped, what you just said, which is the 40 million, but that's over 10 years.
Now this, go ahead.
But some of these could be reverted back to the applicant if the city does not come up with a long-term solution within 10 years.
Correct. Commence construction.
Commence construction.
Right. Now again, this is primarily the Sullivan Square issue. If we go to the next slide to get a more comprehensive understanding of all the payments, we've just, on the top line, the transportation payments are just brought forward from the previous slide. The other mitigation is that series of mitigation measures, mostly in the BAFO, the best and final offer, over 15 years amounts to about $24 million. The look-back provisions is to be determined, so you get a total range of about 50 to 100 million, plus the look-back provision. And some of those are lump sum payments, but it's based over the 15-year license.
Can you refresh our memory of the 24 million of the other mitigation payments?
Sure. If we go back to,
Oh.
yep, that slide. It's basically adding up these numbers and multiplying times the yearly payments.
So this applies to the city of Boston only?
Yes, this is only the city of
Only the
Boston.
city of Boston. The other surrounding communities, Malden and everything
This is just the
separate?
city of Boston.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
What? Rick,
Oh,
I'm sorry, I got to go see the screen again with the BAFO
Oh.
arrangements, if we can go back to that real quick. 750. Okay, and now go forward, Melissa, to the screen. The other mitigation payment line includes the one-time payments? There's an annual payment on a couple of line items, and there's also one-time payments.
Yeah, they include the one-time payment.
Thank you, Rick, very helpful. So I'm just going to wrap this up with a, just to say that this condition reaffirms that Wynn and the city of Boston can negotiate an alternative to these outlined. I mean, this in no way prohibits a different agreement if those two, if the city and Wynn choose to negotiate something separate than this. In absent of that agreement, we have certainly used our best judgment in trying to mitigate all of the impacts here. Ideally, we've said this before, an agreement reached by the entities involved is a better agreement. So we just want to reiterate that here. And I also want to say that we work collaboratively, as you can see, my presentation with Commissioner McHugh, there was a number of areas in which we overlapped. Commissioner McHugh had input with this condition as well. And so I just would like at this time to ask if Commissioner McHugh has anything to add to this, this proposed condition from his perspective.
No, I have nothing to add. There are just a couple of sort of overarching thoughts. This is designed, as has been clearly pointed out, to incentivize reduction in traffic. We tend to look at typically a traffic problem as a problem that requires bigger roads. But this is a dense urban area. We don't have infinite capacity for bigger roads. And in addition, to add to the complexity of this, the current situation at Sullivan Square is change is desired to it, and there is an extensive planning process that's gone on. So there's a moving target here. So this approach that Commissioner Cameron has suggested is designed to think about varieties of ways and incentivize thinking about varieties of ways to reduce the amount of traffic that's there and that's going to be coming to and from the site. We looked, for example, the other day at the public transportation routes. Included at the end of those public transportation routes are parking lots. They're filled during the day with commuters. They're empty at night. And I'm sure that's been looked at. But those are the kinds of things that it seems to me on both the proposals, but principally for the Wynn proposal, one could take a look at to think about how to reduce the overall volume of traffic. And ultimately, the solution to this is not, as I said yesterday during my presentation, solely within Wynn's power. Wynn is simply one actor in an environment that requires the cooperation of governmental entities in order to succeed. So that's why it's important to understand that the number, the target number, is a number not that the Commission is going to recommend, but that if this is to work at all, the political entities responsible for the permitting process and the approval process have got to coalesce around and designate. Otherwise, this simply isn't going to work. So those were just a couple of larger picture thoughts that I wanted to offer.
Thank you. Very, very well stated. Anything else before we conclude?
I should say that we're concentrated on Wynn here because on the Mohegan Sun side, it's in a different environment. It is still in a dense environment, but it so happens that the traffic picture can more easily be mitigated, and it has been mitigated to the satisfaction. The plans are there. So that's why the concentration is here on this side, and that's why much more work has to be done. It's because of the geography of the immediately surrounding area. It's not to favor one over the other on that, but it is a reflection of reality.
Anything else before we conclude? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you.
All right, it's now 11:20, it will be 12:20, at some, 11:40, we'll get there. Where's Janice? Can we take a break for lunch now? So I think that's what we'll do. We'll break a little bit early, we'll take an hour, and we'll resume at 12:40 and deal with the development presentation.